I'm Jacqueline, 28 years old, and I never thought I'd be standing in a courtroom fighting my own father for my inheritance. My grandfather Harold left me his business empire worth millions, and now my father wanted to take it all away. As I stood there watching my dad point at me in front of his friend the judge, I felt my heart racing. "This girl only knows how to waste what she doesn't deserve," he declared with venom in his voice. The judge nodded sympathetically, and my father's lawyer smiled, certain of their victory. But they had no idea what was coming. Let me know where you're watching from, and hit that like and subscribe button to see how two simple words changed everything in that courtroom. My childhood wasn't exactly picture perfect. My parents divorced when I was just 7 years old, leaving me caught in the middle of their bitter separation. My mother did her best to provide a stable home, working two jobs to keep us afloat. But the emotional scars of the divorce ran deep. My father Douglas practically vanished from my life after the separation, only appearing occasionally when it suited him. The brightest spot in my childhood was my relationship with my grandfather Harold. He was a self-made man who had built a successful organic food store chain from nothing. Every weekend, my mother would drive me to his sprawling farmhouse in the countryside, and those weekends quickly became the highlight of my life. "Jackie," Grandpa Harold would say as we walked through his apple orchards, "success isn't about having money. It's about creating something meaningful and treating people right along the way." He had calloused hands and a weathered face that told the story of his hard work and determination. My grandfather taught me everything about his business. By the time I was 12, I could explain organic farming practices, inventory management, and customer service principles. He would let me help around the stores during summer breaks, starting with simple tasks like stocking shelves, and eventually trusting me with more responsibility as I grew older. "You have a good head for business, Jackie," he'd tell me with pride in his eyes. "You remind me of myself when I was young, determined and willing to learn." Meanwhile, my relationship with my father deteriorated further. Douglas would occasionally call or visit, but these interactions always felt forced and uncomfortable. He never asked about my interests or achievements. Instead, our brief conversations revolved around his life, his problems, and occasionally requests for money. "Dad needs a small loan," he'd say during one of his rare visits, "just until my next business venture takes off." These small loans were never repaid, and his business ventures never seemed to materialize into anything substantial. When I graduated high school with honors and received a scholarship to study business administration, my grandfather attended the ceremony with tears in his eyes. My father claimed he had an important meeting and couldn't make it. I later discovered through social media that he'd been at a golf resort that weekend. During college, I spent my summers working at my grandfather's headquarters, learning the corporate side of the business. Harold introduced me to suppliers, business partners, and loyal customers. "This is my granddaughter, Jacqueline," he'd say with unmistakable pride. "She'll be running this place someday." My father scoffed at this notion whenever it was mentioned. "Playing shopkeeper isn't a real career," he told me during one of our infrequent phone calls. "You should be looking for a rich husband instead of wasting your time with Dad's little grocery stores." His dismissive attitude hurt, but I'd learned to expect nothing less from him. When I was 23 and had just completed my MBA, my grandfather was diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave him 6 months, but in typical Harold fashion, he was determined to make the most of whatever time he had left. "I'm not afraid of dying, Jackie," he told me as we sat on his porch watching the sunset. "I'm only afraid of leaving things unfinished." We spent those final months going through every aspect of his business empire. He shared his vision for the future, his concerns about industry changes, and his hopes for the legacy he'd built. During this time, Douglas suddenly reappeared, visiting his father with unusual frequency. These visits always happened when I wasn't around, and they left my grandfather exhausted and troubled. Once I arrived early and overheard them arguing. "You haven't shown any interest in this business for 20 years, Doug," my grandfather said firmly. "You can't just waltz in now and expect to take over." "I'm your son," my father responded angrily. "Everything you built should rightfully come to me, not to some girl who doesn't even carry your last name." I quietly left without letting them know I had heard, but the conversation haunted me. That evening, my grandfather took my hand and made me promise something. "Promise me you'll protect what I've built, Jackie," he said, his voice weaker than I'd ever heard it. Not for the money, but for the people who depend on it and the values it stands for. I promised him I would not, realizing how soon I would be tested. 3 months later, Harold passed away peacefully in his sleep. I sat by his bed holding his hand until the very end. My father didn't arrive until hours after he was gone, his eyes dry and his demeanor oddly distant as he asked about funeral arrangements and, more pointedly, about the will reading. The last time I saw my grandfather's face, he looked peaceful. I whispered a final promise to him. "I'll make you proud, Grandpa. I'll make sure everything you built continues to grow and thrive." Little did I know how difficult keeping that promise would soon become. The day of my grandfather's funeral was unseasonably cold. A bitter wind swept through the cemetery, rustling the flowers placed atop his casket. I stood silently as the pastor spoke about Harold's life, his contributions to the community, and the legacy he left behind. My mother stood beside me, her arm around my shoulders, offering silent support. My father arrived late, dressed in an expensive suit that looked brand new. He stood at the back of the gathering, nodding at acquaintances, but keeping his distance from me. Throughout the service, I could feel his eyes on me, calculating and cold. After the funeral closed, family and friends gathered at the farmhouse. Douglas circulated through the crowd accepting condolences, as though he had been an integral part of Harold's life. I overheard him reminiscing about fishing trips and business discussions that I knew had never happened. "Your grandfather and I were planning a major expansion before he got sick," he told one of Harold's longtime business associates. "He wanted me to take a more active role in the company." 3 days later, we gathered at the office of Harold's attorney, Martin Brooks, for the reading of the will. The small conference room felt claustrophobic as we waited. My father sat across from me, drumming his fingers on the polished table. Mr. Brooks entered carrying a thick folder. "Thank you all for coming," he said, adjusting his glasses. Harold was very specific about his wishes, and he revised his will just 2 months before his passing, ensuring everything was in order. As the attorney began reading the formal legal language, my father leaned forward, his expression eager. I kept my eyes down, focusing on my hands folded in my lap. I had no expectations. Grandpa Harold had already given me so much through his knowledge and guidance. "To my beloved granddaughter, Jacqueline," Mr. Brooks read, "I leave my entire business holdings, including Harmony Organic store chain, valued at approximately $8 million, the family farm and property, and 30% ownership stake in Westfield Investment Group." The room fell silent. I looked up, stunned by what I had just heard. Mr. Brooks continued. "Harold wanted me to read this personal note. Jackie, you have shown the dedication, intelligence, and heart needed to carry my life's work forward. I know you will honor the principles this business was built upon and take it to new heights I could only dream of." My father's face transformed before my eyes. The polite mask slipped away, revealing unbridled anger. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, standing so abruptly that his chair toppled backward. My father wasn't in his right mind. She manipulated him when he was weak and dying. "Mr. Davidson," the attorney responded calmly, "your father was of sound mind when he made these decisions. He was evaluated by 2 independent physicians who confirmed his mental capacity." "I don't care what some doctors said," Douglas shouted. "She's been poisoning his mind against me for years. I'm his son, his only child. Everything should have come to me." Mr. Brooks removed his glasses. "Harold did leave you something, Mr. Davidson. A sum of $50,000 and his collection of fishing equipment." My father's face reddened. "50,000? That's insulting. I'll contest this. I'll fight this all the way." He stormed toward me, pointing his finger inches from my face. "You think you've won? This isn't over. You tricked a sick old man, but you won't trick the courts. I'll make sure everyone knows what you really are." With that, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The attorney looked at me apologetically. "I'm sorry about that, Jacqueline. Your grandfather anticipated this reaction. He left documentation explaining his decision should Douglas contest the will." In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into learning every aspect of my grandfather's business. The transition wasn't easy. Some employees, particularly those in executive positions, were skeptical about taking direction from a 23-year-old. But I had Harold's training and my own education to guide me. I started by listening to employees, customers, suppliers. I learned about their challenges and ideas. Many had suggestions they'd never felt comfortable sharing with my grandfather, despite his open door policy. I implemented changes gradually, always keeping Harold's core values at the center. We expanded our product lines to include more locally sourced items. I invested in renewable energy for our stores, reducing costs while improving our environmental footprint. We launched a mobile app that allowed customers to pre-order and learn about the origins of our products. Within 6 months, sales had increased by 15%. By the end of the first year, we had opened 2 new locations and increased staff wages across the board. The business that my grandfather had built was thriving under my stewardship. Using some of the profits, I established the Harold Davidson Scholarship Fund, providing educational opportunities to children from farming communities. It felt like the perfect way to honor my grandfather's belief in education and opportunity. After 2 years of hard work and growth, the business had nearly doubled in value. Industry publications featured articles about our innovative approach and community involvement. I felt like I was fulfilling my promise to my grandfather, honoring his legacy while creating something new. Then the certified letter arrived. My father was contesting the will, claiming I had exerted undue influence over Harold during his illness. He wanted everything: the stores, the farm, the investments, all of it. The legal document trembled in my hands as I read the accusations. Douglas claimed that Harold had promised him the business for years. He alleged that I had isolated my grandfather during his illness, manipulating him into changing his will. The claims were absurd, but the lawsuit was very real. What hurt most was the final paragraph. The plaintiff seeks full control of all assets currently under the defendant's management, as well as compensation for lost income during the period of wrongful possession. Not only did my father want to take everything my grandfather had entrusted to me, but he also wanted to erase all the work I'd done to grow the business. It felt like he was trying to erase me from my grandfather's legacy entirely. I placed the letter on my desk and looked out the window at the sprawling headquarters of Harmony Organics. Employees were arriving for work, many waving cheerfully as they passed my office. These people depended on me now, just as they had once depended on Harold. "I won't let you down, Grandpa," I whispered, picking up the phone to call my attorney. "I won't let him destroy what we've built." The legal notice had arrived on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, I was sitting in the office of Sarah Martinez, the top litigation attorney in our city. Her office was modest but elegant, with framed diplomas and awards lining one wall. Sarah herself was a striking woman in her 50s, with salt and pepper hair and penetrating dark eyes that missed nothing. "Your grandfather's will is solid, Jacqueline," she said after reviewing the documents I'd brought. "Harold took every precaution to ensure it would withstand challenges. He had medical evaluations videotape the signing and provided extensive written explanations for his decisions." "So my father doesn't have a case?" I asked, feeling a tentative relief. Sarah's expression turned serious. "Legally speaking, his case is weak, but there's something you should know about the judge assigned to your case." She pulled up a file on her computer. "Richard Taylor. He and your father have a history." She turned the screen toward me, showing a local newspaper article with a photograph of Judge Taylor and my father at a charity golf tournament. They stood side by side, laughing comfortably like old friends. "They went to law school together," Sarah explained. "They've maintained social connections over the years. Normally, a judge would recuse himself from a case involving a friend, but Taylor hasn't—" I finished, the knot in my stomach tightening. "No, he hasn't, and he's known for giving considerable leeway to the attorneys he favors. Your father has hired Thomas Warren, who regularly plays golf with Taylor." She leaned forward. "I'm not saying the case is rigged, but we're facing an uphill battle." Over the next few weeks, Sarah and her team dug deeper into my father's claims and his relationship with Judge Taylor. What they discovered was disturbing. One of Sarah's paralegals uncovered emails between my father and his personal attorney dating back 3 years, discussing strategies to contest Harold's will, regardless of what it contained. One email sent just after my grandfather's cancer diagnosis read, "Old man won't last long. Need to position for favorable distribution when the time comes." The evidence suggested my father had been planning this move since learning of Harold's illness, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was calculated and cold even for Douglas. More concerning were the connections between my father and Judge Taylor. They weren't just casual acquaintances or old-school friends. Financial records showed business dealings between them, a restaurant venture, property investments, even a shared ownership in a small private plane. "This is a clear conflict of interest," Sarah said when she showed me the findings. "We can file a motion requesting Judge Taylor recuse himself based on these connections." "Will that work?" I asked. She sighed. "It should, but Taylor has denied similar motions in the past. He tends to claim his personal relationships don't affect his judicial judgment." As we prepared our legal defense, I received an unexpected phone call one evening. It was my father. "Jackie," he said, using the nickname only my grandfather had earned the right to use. "This doesn't have to get ugly. We can settle this between us without the courts." "What are you proposing?" I asked coldly. "You turn over 70% of the business to me. You can keep the farm and a minority stake. I'll withdraw the lawsuit, and we can both move on with our lives." I almost laughed. 70%? You want me to hand over most of what Grandpa built? Why would I do that? His voice hardened. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows how you manipulated a dying old man. I'll drag Harold's name through the mud if necessary." "Is that what you want for his legacy? You're threatening to damage Grandpa's reputation to get what you want." I was stunned by his brazenness. "I'm offering you a clean way out," he replied smoothly. "Think about it. The business will suffer during a prolonged legal battle. Customers don't like controversy. Suppliers get nervous. By the time we're finished in court, there might not be much left worth fighting over." "I'll see you in court, Dad," I said, ending the call. That night, I couldn't sleep. My father's threat to tarnish my grandfather's reputation weighed heavily on me. Harold had been respected throughout the community, known for his integrity and generosity. The idea of Douglas dragging that name through the mud was almost unbearable. But the next morning, as I walked through the main production facility and watched employees carefully packaging organic produce for delivery, I knew I couldn't give in. These people counted on me. The business embodied principles my grandfather had lived by. I couldn't betray that just to avoid a fight. Sarah called with troubling news. "Judge Taylor denied our motion for recusal. He claims his relationship with your father is not close enough to constitute a conflict of interest." I wasn't surprised, but the confirmation still stung. "So what do we do now?" "We prepare like hell," she said firmly. "And I think we need to look beyond just defending the will. We need to investigate further into your father's actions before Harold's death. Something doesn't add up here." Sarah assigned her best investigator to dig deeper. Meanwhile, I gathered testimonies from longtime employees about Harold's mental clarity in his final months and his often stated intention to leave the business to me. A week before the trial, the investigator made a breakthrough. He discovered that my father had visited Harold 3 times when he was heavily medicated during his final weeks. The hospice nurse remembered Douglas bringing papers for Harold to sign, though she couldn't recall what they were. Most crucially, the investigator found a recording device in Harold's home office, one my grandfather had installed himself. Harold, ever meticulous about business matters, had apparently taken to recording important conversations during his illness to compensate for potential memory issues caused by his medication. When we listened to those recordings, I heard my grandfather's voice for the first time since his death. Tears streamed down my face as his familiar though weakened voice filled the room. But those tears quickly dried as I heard the conversation between him and my father just 2 weeks before Harold died. "Just sign here, Dad," Douglas was saying. "It's just updating your medical directives like the doctor suggested." "I can barely see the print," my grandfather responded. "What does it say?" "Nothing important, standard legal stuff." "You know lawyers, they make everything complicated." There was a pause. Then Harold's voice suddenly stronger. "If it's not important, then you won't mind if I have Martin look it over tomorrow." "We don't have time for that," Douglas snapped. "Just sign it now, unless you don't trust your own son." "I trust my son," Harold replied quietly. "But I'm not signing anything I can't read. Not anymore." The recording continued, with Douglas growing increasingly agitated before finally leaving. In a subsequent recording, dated the next day, Harold spoke alone, apparently aware he was being recorded. If anyone is listening to this after I'm gone, I want to be clear about my wishes. My business and the majority of my estate should go to my granddaughter, Jacqueline. She has earned it through her dedication and understanding of what I've built. My son Douglas has shown no interest in the business, except as something to sell for quick profit. I am of sound mind making this statement despite what my son might claim later. Sarah looked at me, her expression serious but hopeful. This changes everything, Jacqueline. This is exactly what we needed. As the trial date approached, I felt both dread and determination. The recordings were powerful evidence, but Judge Taylor still controlled the courtroom. My father had powerful attorneys and wasn't above using dirty tactics. The night before the trial, I visited my grandfather's grave. The headstone was simple, as he had requested, engraved with his name dates, and the words he had lived by: integrity above all. "I'm fighting for your legacy tomorrow, Grandpa," I said quietly. "I hope I make you proud." The county courthouse was an imposing limestone building with towering columns and broad steps leading to heavy wooden doors. As I climbed those steps beside Sarah, I felt like I was walking into a lion's den. My navy blue suit felt constricting, and the professional bun I'd twisted my hair into pulled uncomfortably at my scalp. Inside, the polished marble floors echoed with our footsteps as we made our way to courtroom 3. A handful of reporters loitered in the hallway. Apparently, a battle over an $8 million business empire was newsworthy, especially when it involved family betrayal. "Keep your eyes forward," Sarah murmured. "No comments to the press." The courtroom was already half full when we entered. Local business owners, employees from Harmony Organics, and curious members of the public filled the spectator benches. I spotted my mother sitting near the back, her expression a mix of worry and resolve. My father was already seated at the plaintiff's table, looking immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Beside him sat Thomas Warren, his high-profile attorney, a man known for aggressive tactics and theatrical courtroom performances. They were deep in whispered conversation, but Douglas looked up as I entered, his eyes narrowing slightly, before his lips curved into a cold smile. Judge Richard Taylor entered from his chambers, and the bailiff called for all to rise. Taylor was a stocky man in his early 60s with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He moved with the confident authority of someone accustomed to having the final word. "Be seated," he instructed, arranging papers on his bench. "We're here today in the matter of Davidson versus Davidson case number 2023, CV 4872, a contest of will and estate distribution." As the proceedings began, I studied Judge Taylor's face, looking for signs of bias. His expression remained neutral as he reviewed the case details, but I noticed how his gaze lingered sympathetically on my father, while barely acknowledging me. Warren rose for his opening statement, adjusting his crimson tie before addressing the court. "Your Honor, this case is about a son's rightful inheritance, callously diverted through undue influence during a vulnerable time. Douglas Davidson, the only child of the deceased, Harold Davidson, was systematically excluded from his dying father's bedside by the defendant, who took advantage of an elderly man's weakened state to manipulate his final wishes. He paced deliberately before the bench, his voice rising with practiced emotion. We will prove that Harold Davidson was not of sound mind when he signed the contested will, that the defendant isolated him from family during his illness, and that the deceased had previously expressed clear intentions to leave his business to his son, the rightful heir to his life's work." Sarah's opening was concise and straightforward, focusing on the legal soundness of the will and my grandfather's documented mental capacity. She mentioned the medical evaluations and the video recording of the will signing, but held back on revealing our strongest evidence. We had agreed that the recordings of my father's attempted manipulation would have the most impact if introduced at the right moment. Throughout the morning, Warren presented witnesses, former business associates of my grandfather, a distant cousin, even a housekeeper who had worked briefly at the farmhouse during Harold's illness. Each testimony followed the same carefully constructed narrative. Harold had allegedly expressed intentions to leave everything to Douglas. I had supposedly limited visitors during his illness. Harold had appeared confused and easily influenced near the end. Judge Taylor allowed Warren considerable latitude, permitting leading questions and hearsay that should have been inadmissible. Whenever Sarah objected, Taylor overruled her with barely a consideration. During a brief recess, Sarah squeezed my hand reassuringly. "Stay calm," she whispered. "They're building their case on shaky ground. Our turn will come." When court resumed, my father took the stand. Under Warren's gentle questioning, he painted a picture of himself as a devoted son who had always expected to inherit the family business. "My father and I had an understanding," Douglas claimed, his voice catching with well-rehearsed emotion. "He built that business for the family legacy for me to eventually take over and pass down to my children." "And why didn't you work directly in the business in recent years?" Warren asked. Douglas sighed dramatically. "My father wanted me to gain outside experience. We agreed I would explore other ventures, build my own expertise, and then return to lead Harmony Organics when the time was right." It was a masterful performance, and I had to admire his ability to lie so convincingly. The Douglas on the stand bore no resemblance to the man who had belittled my grandfather's little grocery stores and shown up at the funeral primarily to check on his inheritance. "And what changed?" Warren prompted. My father's expression darkened. "When my father became ill, Jacqueline took control. She was always there, always whispering in his ear. By the time I realized how serious his condition was, she had already convinced him to change his will." Warren nodded sympathetically. "And what do you believe motivated your niece's actions?" "Objection," Sarah called. "Calls for speculation." "I'll allow it," Judge Taylor responded without hesitation. "The witness may answer." Douglas looked directly at me, for the first time, his eyes cold. "Greed, pure and simple. She saw an opportunity to take what wasn't rightfully hers, and she took it." Then came the moment that would be burned into my memory forever. My father stood up from the witness stand, pointed directly at me, and declared in a voice trembling with manufactured outrage, "This girl only knows how to waste what she doesn't deserve. She has no right to my father's life's work." Judge Taylor nodded in apparent agreement, while Warren smiled smugly, clearly satisfied with his client's performance. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, and I felt all eyes on me, some curious, some judgmental. Sarah scribbled a note and pushed it toward me. "Stay calm. Our turn soon." After a grueling cross-examination where Sarah tried to expose the contradictions in my father's testimony, but was repeatedly limited by Judge Taylor's interventions, it was finally my turn to testify. As I was sworn in, I caught sight of my mother in the gallery. She gave me a subtle nod of encouragement. I took a deep breath and prepared to fight for my grandfather's true wishes. The witness stand felt exposed, like being on a small island, with all eyes watching your every move. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down, smoothing my skirt with suddenly clammy hands. Sarah approached with a reassuring smile. "Ms. Davidson, could you please tell the court about your relationship with your grandfather?" I described my close bond with Harold, the weekends at the farm, the lessons in business and values that he had instilled in me. I explained how he had encouraged my education in business administration and gradually increased my responsibilities in the company. "He didn't just hand me opportunities," I emphasized. "He made me earn them. Every summer during college, I started at the bottom, stocking shelves, working the registers, making deliveries. He wanted me to understand every aspect of the business from the ground up." Sarah nodded. "And during his illness, what was your role?" "I balanced my time between running the day-to-day operations and being there for him," I explained. "Grandpa insisted the business couldn't stop just because he was sick. He used to say hundreds of families depend on those paychecks, Jackie." Throughout my direct testimony, Judge Taylor appeared bored, checking his watch repeatedly and shuffling papers. When Warren stood for cross-examination, however, the judge's attention suddenly sharpened. "Ms. Davidson," Warren began, his tone condescending, "you expect this court to believe that a 23-year-old with practically no real-world experience was better qualified to take over a multi-million-dollar business than your father, who had decades of business experience?" "My father has never worked a day in Harmony Organics," I replied calmly. "His business experience consists primarily of failed ventures that my grandfather ultimately had to bail out." Warren's eyes narrowed. "Isn't it true that you deliberately scheduled your visits with Harold during times when your father couldn't be there?" "No, that's not true. I was there almost daily because I was helping run the business. My father could have visited any time. And isn't it true, Warren continued, his voice rising dramatically, that you suggested the changes to Harold's will yourself? Absolutely not. The will reflected his wishes, which he had expressed to me and others for years. Warren approached the witness stand, standing uncomfortably close. Ms. Davidson, do you really expect this court to believe that Harold would disinherit his only son in favor of his granddaughter unless he was being manipulated during a vulnerable time? I maintained eye contact, refusing to be intimidated. My grandfather made his decision based on who would best preserve what he had built. He valued the business as more than just an asset to be sold off, which was my father's only interest in it. Warren slammed his hand on the railing. So you're claiming your father only wanted the money. That's a convenient narrative, isn't it? Objection argumentative, Sarah called. Overruled, Judge Taylor responded immediately. The witness will answer. I took a deep breath. I'm not claiming anything about my father's motives. I'm stating facts about my grandfather's wishes, which were documented legally and with sound mind. Warren paced before the bench. Let's discuss your management of the business since Harold's death. You've made significant changes to the operation, haven't you? Changes that Harold might not have approved of. I've grown the business in line with my grandfather's vision and values, I countered. Revenue is up 30%, we've opened 3 new locations, and employee satisfaction scores are at an all-time high. Impressive claims, Warren said dismissively. But isn't it true that you've used the business as your personal playground? Taking excessive salary and benefits while playing entrepreneur with someone else's life's work. This was too much. My salary is 20% lower than industry standard for a CEO of a comparable company, I stated firmly. Every major decision is approved by the board my grandfather established. I've reinvested profits into expansion and employee benefits exactly as my grandfather would have wanted. For nearly an hour, Warren continued his aggressive questioning, trying to paint me as manipulative, inexperienced, and greedy. Judge Taylor allowed him considerable latitude, even when his questions became repetitive or clearly intended to provoke an emotional reaction. Finally, Warren turned to the judge. Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness who has clearly rehearsed her answers extensively with counsel. As Warren returned to his seat, Sarah stood. Redirect, Your Honor. Judge Taylor sighed audibly. Make it brief, counselor. Sarah approached me with a document. Ms. Davidson, are you familiar with this financial statement showing the company's performance before and after you took over management? Yes, this is our annual report from last year. And could you tell the court how the business has performed under your leadership? I outlined the growth metrics, the expansion projects, and the community initiatives I had implemented. We've increased revenue while maintaining the core values my grandfather established. Our employee retention rate is 97%, and we've been voted one of the best places to work in the state for 2 consecutive years. Sarah nodded. One final question. Did your grandfather ever express to you directly his wishes regarding the business succession? Yes, many times, I replied. But most clearly in the last week of his life when he told me, I'm entrusting you with my life's work, Jackie, because you understand that it's about more than money. It's about the people, the land, and doing business the right way. Warren jumped to his feet. Objection, hearsay. Before Judge Taylor could rule, Sarah quickly added, Your Honor, the plaintiff opened the door to this line of testimony by extensively questioning the witness about Harold Davidson's intentions. Judge Taylor frowned. I'll allow it, but the court will give it appropriate weight. Sarah gathered her notes. No further questions, Your Honor. As I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt drained, but also strangely empowered. I had spoken my truth, honoring my grandfather's memory as best I could. The afternoon proceeded with expert witnesses from both sides debating Harold's mental capacity and the legal validity of the will. The medical experts confirmed that while Harold had been physically weakened by cancer and medication, his cognitive functions had remained intact until very near the end. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Warren appeared confident, exchanging satisfied glances with my father. Judge Taylor announced we would continue the following morning with closing arguments. Ms. Martinez, do you have any additional witnesses or evidence to present? He asked, clearly expecting a negative response. Sarah stood. Yes, Your Honor. We have critical evidence that directly addresses the allegations made by the plaintiff. We'd like to present it first thing tomorrow morning. Judge Taylor looked annoyed but nodded. Very well. Court is adjourned until 9 a.m. tomorrow. As we gathered our materials, my father approached Warren, hovering protectively nearby. It's not too late to settle Jackie, Douglas said quietly. This judge is an old friend. You won't win here. I looked into his eyes, the same hazel color as mine, the same as my grandfather's, and saw nothing of the man who had raised me, however briefly. See you tomorrow, Dad, I said, turning away. That night, Sarah and I reviewed the recordings one last time, confirming they were ready to be played in court. The plan was set. All that remained was to execute it and hope that even a biased judge couldn't ignore such damning evidence. Get some rest, Sarah advised as we parted. Tomorrow will be intense. I tried to follow her advice, but sleep eluded me. Around midnight, I went to my grandfather's study in the farmhouse, where his presence still felt strongest. I sat in his worn leather chair, running my fingers over the desk where he had taught me so much. I'm doing my best, Grandpa, I whispered into the quiet room. I hope it's enough. The courtroom was packed the next morning. Word had spread about the contentious inheritance battle, drawing even more spectators and local press. I spotted several employees from Harmony Organics sitting together, their expressions supportive. Judge Taylor called the court to order promptly at 9. Before we proceed to closing arguments, I understand the defense has additional evidence to present. Sarah stood confidently. Yes, Your Honor. We'd like to present audio recordings made by Harold Davidson in the weeks before his death. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat while Warren leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear. What kind of recordings? Judge Taylor asked, frowning. Harold Davidson installed recording equipment in his home office during his illness to help compensate for any memory issues caused by his medication, Sarah explained. These recordings document conversations relevant to the allegations made in this case. Warren was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. We have not been provided with these alleged recordings during discovery. This is an ambush tactic. Sarah remained calm. Your Honor, these recordings were discovered only last week during our continuing investigation. We notified opposing counsel immediately upon verification of their authenticity as required by law. Warren's face reddened. Your Honor, we need time to review these recordings and verify their authenticity before they can be admitted. Judge Taylor looked torn. His friendship with my father suggested he would find a reason to exclude the evidence, but the presence of reporters and spectators complicated matters. Excluding potentially crucial evidence without proper justification could raise questions about his impartiality. After a moment's consideration, he ruled, the court will allow the recordings, but their authenticity and relevance will be evaluated as they are presented. Warren continued to object, but Judge Taylor cut him off. That's my ruling, counselor. Proceed, Ms. Martinez. Sarah nodded to her assistant, who set up the audio equipment. Your Honor, the first recording is dated September 12th of last year, approximately 3 weeks before Harold Davidson's death. The courtroom fell silent as my grandfather's voice filled the room, weak but clear. I'm recording this to keep my thoughts organized. The medication makes things foggy sometimes. Douglas visited today after almost 6 months of no contact. He suddenly wants to help with the business, asked a lot of questions about the will. When I mentioned Jackie would be taking over, he became angry, said something about blood being thicker than water. I told him the business needs someone who understands it, not someone who just sees dollar signs. He stormed out. I worry about what he might do. Warren objected again, claiming the recording was prejudicial, but Judge Taylor, now aware of the press attention, overruled him. The second recording was the one that had brought tears to my eyes when I first heard it. The one where Douglas tried to trick his dying father into signing documents under false pretenses. As the audio played, I watched my father's face. His confident expression crumbled, replaced by something between rage and panic. He whispered frantically to Warren, who looked increasingly concerned. The final recording was the most damning. My grandfather's clear statement of his wishes recorded the day after Douglas's attempted deception. I've suspected for some time that Douglas might contest my will. Let me be absolutely clear. I am leaving the majority of my estate, including Harmony Organics, to my granddaughter Jacqueline. This decision is made with full mental faculty and after careful consideration. Douglas has shown no interest in the business except as something to sell for profit. Jackie has worked alongside me for years, understands our mission, and has earned the right to carry it forward. This is my final decision made freely and without any influence from anyone. When the recording ended, the courtroom remained silent for several long seconds. I glanced at the jury box where several jurors were looking at my father with undisguised disapproval. Sarah stood. Your Honor, we also have testimony from the hospice nurse who witnessed Douglas Davidson attempting to have his father sign documents while heavily medicated, consistent with what we heard in the recordings. Before she could continue, I made my decision. Standing up, I addressed the court directly. 2 words, Your Honor, banker's box. A collective murmur ran through the courtroom as Sarah quickly adapted to my unexpected intervention. Ms. Davidson is referring to evidence contained in this banker's box, she explained, gesturing to her assistant, who brought forward a large storage box. With the court's permission, we'd like to present its contents. Judge Taylor, now looking distinctly uncomfortable, nodded his assent. Sarah removed several folders from the box. These documents contain evidence of financial transactions between Judge Richard Taylor and the plaintiff Douglas Davidson over the past 5 years. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Taylor's face paled visibly. Specifically, Sarah continued, joint ownership of a vacation property in Aspen, shared investment in 3 restaurant franchises, and a loan of $200,000 from Mr. Davidson to Judge Taylor that appears to remain outstanding. Warren was on his feet. This is outrageous, completely irrelevant to the case at hand. On the contrary, Sarah countered, these financial entanglements create a clear conflict of interest that should have resulted in Judge Taylor's recusal from this case. All eyes turned to Judge Taylor, whose complexion had gone from pale to ashen. My father sat frozen, his expression unreadable. Furthermore, Sarah continued relentlessly, we have emails between Mr. Davidson and Judge Taylor discussing this very case before it was even filed. She produced printed copies of emails offering them to the court clerk. In these communications dated 3 months ago, Mr. Davidson assures Judge Taylor that, and I quote, once this is settled and I have control of the assets, our Bermuda project can move forward. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Judge Taylor cleared his throat, adjusting his robe nervously. In light of this information, he said, his voice strained, I am recusing myself from this case effective immediately. Court is adjourned pending reassignment to another judge. He stood abruptly and retreated to his chambers without another word. My father remained seated, staring straight ahead as Warren tried unsuccessfully to get his attention. As people began filing out of the courtroom, buzzing with excitement over the dramatic turn of events, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and exhaustion. My grandfather's voice on those recordings had reminded me exactly what I was fighting for. Not just the business, but the principles of honesty and integrity that he had lived by. Sarah squeezed my arm. That was unexpected, but effective, she said quietly. The banker's box was a masterful touch. Where did 2 words come from, though? I smiled tiredly. Sometimes you need to shake things up to get to the truth. I think Grandpa would have approved. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements, but Sarah deftly guided me through the crowd to her waiting car. As we pulled away, I caught sight of my father standing alone on the courthouse steps, looking suddenly old and defeated. Despite everything, I felt a momentary pang of sadness for what might have been if he had chosen a different path. But that feeling was quickly replaced by determination to honor my grandfather's legacy and trust in me. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time since receiving that lawsuit, I felt confident that justice would prevail. 1 week after Judge Taylor's dramatic recusal, our case was reassigned to Judge Eliza Washington, a veteran jurist known for her strict adherence to legal ethics and no-nonsense courtroom. The contrast with Taylor could not have been more striking. Judge Washington began by ordering a complete review of all evidence and testimony. We're starting with a clean slate, she announced in our first preliminary hearing. Any hint of impropriety or procedural irregularity from the previous proceedings will be addressed. My father appeared subdued during this hearing, the confident swagger replaced by a wary caution. His high-profile attorney, Warren, had mysteriously withdrawn from the case, citing irreconcilable differences with the client. Douglas had replaced him with Alan Prescott, a competent but less flamboyant lawyer. Meanwhile, the local legal community was abuzz with news that the State Judicial Ethics Committee had opened an investigation into Judge Taylor, based on the evidence we had presented in court. Several of his recent rulings in other cases were now under review, and he had taken an abrupt medical leave of absence. "The dominoes are falling," Sarah informed me over lunch after the preliminary hearing. "3 other litigants who lost cases before Taylor where your father had interests are now filing for appeals. This could unravel years of questionable judgments." I felt vindicated, but not particularly triumphant. I never wanted to bring down a judge. I just wanted to protect what Grandpa built. Sarah nodded understandingly. Sometimes justice requires uncomfortable revelations. The day before our case was set to resume, Sarah called with surprising news. "Douglas wants to settle," she said. "His attorney reached out this morning. They're offering to withdraw the lawsuit entirely." "Just like that?" I asked, suspicious of my father's sudden change of heart. "Not exactly," Sarah replied. "He wants a private meeting with you first. No attorneys present." I considered the request. "Do you think it's a trap of some kind?" "I doubt it. My guess is he sees the writing on the wall. Judge Washington has a reputation for being scrupulously fair, and your evidence is strong. Plus, the ethics investigation into Taylor has created unwelcome scrutiny of your father's business dealings." After some deliberation, I agreed to meet Douglas at a neutral location, a conference room at the city library. When I arrived, he was already seated at the long oak table, looking somehow diminished in his expensive suit. "Thank you for coming," he said as I took a seat across from him. I nodded, but remained silent, waiting for him to continue. Douglas cleared his throat. "I'm withdrawing the lawsuit," he said directly. "You can keep the business, the farm, all of it." "Why the sudden change?" I asked, studying his face for signs of deception. He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Let's just say the attention from the Taylor situation has made certain other business arrangements uncomfortable. I need this to go away." "So this isn't about recognizing Grandpa's wishes were valid. It's about damage control." A flash of the old anger crossed his face before he mastered it. "Does it matter? You get what you want either way." "It matters to me," I said quietly. Douglas leaned back in his chair. "Fine. You want the truth? I underestimated you. I thought you were just a kid playing at business that you'd crumble under pressure. I was wrong." This unexpected admission surprised me more than anything else that had happened in the past weeks. "And the business?" I prompted. "Do you still think I'm just wasting what I don't deserve?" He had the grace to look slightly ashamed at having his courtroom outburst quoted back to him. "The business is doing well under your management. Better than it would have under mine, probably." Harold knew what he was doing. He paused, then added reluctantly, "He usually did." We sat in silence for a moment, the admission hanging between us. "There's something else," Douglas finally said. "The ethics investigation into Taylor. It could potentially expand to include some of my other activities." "You're worried about criminal charges," I realized. He didn't deny it. "I'd like your assurance that you won't actively push for further investigation into my business dealings." I considered his request. Part of me wanted him to face consequences for everything. The attempted manipulation of my grandfather, the corrupt relationship with Judge Taylor, the years of neglect, followed by naked greed. But another part of me simply wanted to move forward to focus on honoring my grandfather's legacy, rather than punishing my father's misdeeds. "I won't pursue anything," I said finally. "But I won't interfere with any ongoing investigations either. That's the best I can offer." He nodded, accepting these terms. "Fair enough." He stood to leave, then hesitated. "For what it's worth, your grandfather would be proud. You fought for what he built just like he would have." Coming from Douglas, this was as close to an apology as I was likely to get. I didn't respond, and after a moment he turned and walked out. The next day, Douglas's attorney formally withdrew the lawsuit. Judge Washington, after reviewing all evidence to ensure there was no coercion involved in the withdrawal, dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. News of the outcome spread quickly through the business community. To my surprise, several local publications ran stories not just about the inheritance battle, but about the success Harmony Organics had achieved under my leadership. One business journal even featured me in a cover story titled, Next Generation Leadership: How Jacqueline Davidson Honors Legacy While Driving Innovation. The unwelcome spotlight eventually faded, allowing me to refocus on what mattered most, continuing to build on my grandfather's foundation. We opened 2 new store locations, expanded our sustainable farming initiatives, and increased the Harold Davidson Scholarship Fund to support more students pursuing agricultural and business education. As for Douglas, I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had moved to Arizona apparently to pursue new business opportunities far from the scrutiny he now faced in our community. I didn't wish him ill, but I was relieved to have him out of my life. The legal victory brought closure in many ways, but the emotional wounds of fighting my own father in court would take longer to heal. I found myself wondering how things might have been different if he had been the kind of father who valued family over fortune, the kind of son who had appreciated what Harold tried to teach him. 6 months after the case concluded, I received an unexpected letter from the State Judicial Ethics Committee, thanking me for bringing Taylor's misconduct to light. Their investigation had uncovered a pattern of biased rulings benefiting certain parties, including my father. Taylor had resigned rather than face formal removal proceedings. Justice isn't always swift, Sarah commented when I shared the news, but it usually arrives eventually. I thought about my grandfather, about his insistence that integrity mattered above all else. He had stood by his principles even when it meant acknowledging painful truths, that his own son wasn't the right person to carry forward his life's work. In honoring Harold's wishes, I had not just protected a business, I had defended the values that defined him, that I knew would have mattered to him far more than the money or property involved. The victory wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who had believed in Harold's vision and helped me fight to preserve it. And in some strange way, it even represented a kind of justice for Douglas himself, forcing him to confront truths he had spent years avoiding. As I walked through the original Harmony Organic store greeting longtime employees and customers who had become like family, I felt my grandfather's presence in every corner. This was his real legacy, not just a successful business, but a community built on values worth defending. "We did it, Grandpa," I whispered, pausing beside the framed photo of Harold that hung near the entrance. "We protected what matters." 6 months after the court case concluded, I found myself sitting on the porch of my grandfather's farmhouse, now my farmhouse, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The apple orchard stretched before me, trees heavy with ripening fruit just as they had been during those precious weekends of my childhood. The legal battle had left its mark on me. For weeks after the final resolution, I had trouble sleeping, my mind replaying the courtroom confrontations and my father's accusations. It seemed surreal that my own father had been willing to destroy my reputation and twist my grandfather's legacy just to claim what he felt entitled to. My therapist, Dr. Marin, had been helping me work through these complex emotions during our weekly sessions. Betrayal by a parent creates a special kind of wound, she explained during one session. You're grieving not just the relationship you had, but the relationship you should have had. This framing helped me understand why the victory in court had felt hollow in some ways. I had won the case, but lost any hope of reconciliation with my father. Some days that trade-off seemed worth it. Other days I wasn't so sure. To help process my experiences, I joined a support group for people dealing with toxic family relationships. The stories I heard there, of manipulation, gaslighting, and betrayal by those who should have provided love and support, helped me realize I wasn't alone. More importantly, I saw people who had found healing and built fulfilling lives despite these painful backgrounds. "Family isn't just about blood," said Maria, a woman in her 50s who had cut ties with abusive parents decades earlier. "It's about who shows up for you, who supports your growth, who celebrates your victories without jealousy." This wisdom resonated deeply with me. My grandfather had shown up. My mother, though distant since moving to Oregon with her new husband, had shown up for the trial. And the Harmony Organics community, Employees, customers, suppliers who had become friends over the years, they had shown up too, filling the courtroom with their support. With time, I began channeling my energy into positive developments for the business. We launched a training center on the farm property, offering programs for young people interested in sustainable agriculture and ethical business practices. Many participants came from disadvantaged backgrounds, and watching them discover their capabilities reminded me of my own journey under Harold's guidance. My grandfather believed that everyone deserves a chance to build something meaningful. I told the first cohort of trainees during their orientation. This program is about creating those opportunities for the next generation. The local community college partnered with us to offer credit for our courses, and several larger universities expressed interest in developing internship programs. What had begun as a way to honor Harold's memory was evolving into something he could never have imagined, but would surely have approved. On the personal front, life was gradually finding a new rhythm. I had started dating Andrew Carter, a high school science teacher I met, when his class visited the farm for an educational tour. Unlike previous relationships that had faltered under the demands of my work schedule, Andrew understood my commitment to the business. As a dedicated educator, he had his own passion that required time and energy beyond the standard workday. "We're both builders in our own way," he observed during an early date. "You're building a business that feeds people's bodies, and I'm trying to feed their minds." His perspective and patience helped me find better balance in my life. I was learning that honoring my grandfather's legacy didn't mean working myself to exhaustion. Harold had always made time for family, for community, for moments of quiet appreciation of what he'd built. I was trying to follow that example too. About 8 months after the trial, a letter arrived with an Arizona postmark. I recognized my father's handwriting immediately and almost discarded it unopened. After carrying it around for a few days, curiosity won out. "Jackie." The letter began, the familiar nickname still jarring coming from him. "I've been doing some thinking since the trial. Moving away has given me perspective I didn't have before." The letter continued with what seemed like genuine self-reflection. Douglas wrote about attending therapy himself, about confronting some hard truths regarding his relationship with Harold, and his motivations for contesting the will. "I was never angry about the money, not really," he wrote. "I was angry that Dad saw something in you that he never saw in me. Instead of trying to earn his respect, I resented him for withholding it. And then I resented you for receiving it." The letter ended with a tentative request. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking to be part of the business. But if you'd be willing to talk sometime, I'd appreciate the chance to apologize in person." I showed the letter to Dr. Marine during our next session. "What do you think?" I asked. "Is this genuine or another manipulation?" She handed the letter back without offering a direct opinion. "The more important question is, what do you need? Would speaking with your father bring you closure, or would it reopen wounds that are starting to heal?" I thought about it for several weeks before finally calling the number Douglas had included. Our conversation was brief and somewhat awkward, but it led to an agreement to meet when he visited the state for a former colleague's retirement party. The meeting took place at a quiet cafe downtown. Douglas looked older than I remembered, the strain of recent months evident in the new lines around his eyes. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said as we sat with our coffee. I nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I owe you an apology," he said simply. "What I did, contesting the will, the things I said in court, the arrangement with Taylor, it was wrong. All of it." The directness surprised me. I had expected excuses, qualifications, attempts to share blame. "Why did you do it?" I asked. It was the question that had haunted me for months. Douglas stared into his coffee for a long moment before answering. I told myself it was about what I deserved as Harold's son, but honestly, I was jealous. Not just of the inheritance, but of what you and Dad had. He looked up at me. "He was proud of you, in a way he never was of me. And instead of trying to earn that, I wanted to take what you had." The admission hung between us, raw and honest, in a way Douglas had never been before. "I'm not asking for a relationship," he continued. "I know I haven't earned that. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did, and I regret it." We talked for another hour, not about reconciliation or the future, but about the past. Douglas shared memories of his own complicated relationship with Harold, insights into why he had distanced himself from the family business, regrets about the father he had failed to be for me. When we parted, it wasn't with promises to rebuild our relationship, but with something I hadn't expected: a mutual acknowledgement of pain caused and pain suffered. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but perhaps a necessary step towards something like peace. Back at the farm that evening, I found myself in Harold's study, now my own workspace. On the wall hung a simple framed quote that had guided my grandfather throughout his life. The true measure of a person is how they handle both failure and success. My grandfather had faced many challenges in building his business: economic downturns, competition from large chains, changing consumer preferences. But he had met each one with integrity and determination. Now it was my turn to face challenges, both professional and personal, with the same strength of character. The inheritance battle had taught me something crucial. Legacy isn't just what's written in a will or measured in dollars. True legacy lives in values passed down in wisdom, shared in the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. My grandfather's greatest gift wasn't the business or the property. It was teaching me to recognize the difference between what has price and what has value. The business had price. The principles it was built on had value. I had fought not just for the former, but more importantly, for the latter. As I sat in the gathering dusk, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me since the lawsuit began. The path forward wouldn't always be easy, but I knew now that I had the strength to walk it. Not alone, but carrying with me the lessons of those who had come before, and surrounded by the community I was continuing to build. The true test of a legacy, my grandfather once told me, isn't what you leave behind when you're gone. It's what continues to grow because you were here. By that measure, Harold Davidson's legacy was flourishing, and would continue to do so as long as those of us who learned from him carried his wisdom forward. Have you ever had to stand up for what's rightfully yours against someone you thought should have loved and protected you? Instead, I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this account of my fight for my grandfather's legacy resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of overcoming family betrayal and finding strength in the most challenging circumstances. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the family we choose is more important than the family we're born into.